There's a debate right now between mixed gender sex education classes and one gender sex education classes. And let me talk about what this means. So, whether you are a cis woman, or you're a trans woman, or you're a non-binary person who occasionally identifies or presents as a woman, or whether you are a cis male, or you are a trans male, or you're a non-binary person who occasionally presents or identifies as a man, normally those classes are separated. And they normally do it by assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, because our education system is a little flawed in how it approaches gender and sex. But even if we were to sort and we were to say, okay, let's have everyone who has a penis go in this class, let's have everyone who has a vagina go in this class, and if you're intersex, you pick where you want to go. Or if we were to say everyone who identifies as female go in this class and everyone who identifies as male go in this class, it doesn't really work. But there's a reason why they tend to gender segregate sex education classes. And it's because they found that the way people are socially raised in the United States is that people who identify as women won't ask certain questions around people who identify as male. And the people who identify as male and are cis male tend to make it very clear in their classes how much they hate condoms. And this winds up influencing the sex practices of the people there who have vaginas and identify as women, so the cisgendered women in those classes. We've found that sex education, if not somehow gender segregated, winds up with cis men manipulating the conversation, limiting the scope of the topic, and in general changing how the class takes place. We're not going to gender segregate these classes. I don't care. I don't care what you identify as. You can identify as woman, identify as man, identify as a non-binary person, gender fluid person. You are welcome to attend my class. If you make someone uncomfortable, I will ask you to leave. I will ask you not to come back. So please be respectful. And if you take these classes as an opportunity to attack or denigrate someone's gender identity, someone's sexual identity, someone's gender presentation, someone's sexual presentation, I'm going to have an issue with you. And I do agree that Clark County is a lot better than a lot of places on sex education, Sky.
Yeah, my 7th grade was no, never mind. That was 8th. 7th? Yeah, 8th.
I had decent health classes. I had decent sex ed classes. You know, I know that I have students in places that don't. And even with having decent ones, there's information I'm presenting to y'all I didn't learn until I hit a genetics class in college. So let me break down how these classes are going to work. Each class is going to cover a topic, maybe 2 if we have time. So the comprehensive sex ed that we are offering, which is LGBTQIA inclusive, and which is presented factually to you. These are facts. These are things that are not subjective, they're objective. These subjective facts are going to cover, first, biology. What is sex? What is gender? What does it mean to be intersex? Then it's going to cover anatomy. So what really is going on down there? What's the difference between a vulva and a vagina? What does it mean to have intersex external genitalia presentation? What is the G-spot in a vagina? What is that? Why is there a debate about it? What's the difference between urea and urine? And we're going to go really in depth on that, and it's going to cover erogenous zones, and it's going to cover what not to do, what not to stick inside yourself, what not to clean yourself with. Speaking of cleaning, one of our classes is going to cover bodily hygiene. That may end up tacking on to the end of another one. We're going to be covering the difference between paraphilia, sexual identity, sexual presentation, sexual practices, kink, paraphilic disorders, and pathological paraphilia, because they're all different. So we're going to be covering the differences there. We're going to be going into safe saner sexual practices, what really people need to know. Like, people are going and they're doing things without knowing the safer or saner or risk-aware method of doing them. Now, we may not be able to cover everything, but we're going to try and provide a fairly comprehensive view. We're going to be doing a class on essential oils and aphrodisiacs and all manner of things that it's safe to use and not safe to use. Moving from there, we're going to be covering the dangers of porn. And I'm not talking, I know that there is good porn out there. I know that it exists. I know there are decent companies, but we're going to be talking about medical problems we're starting to see crop up in people who are just becoming sexually active, or people who are going onto college campuses because they see something in porn and they duplicate it without understanding what they're duplicating. We're going to be talking about recovery from things like porn addiction. We're going to talk about recovery from things like sexual trauma. So when we say comprehensive sex ed, that's what we mean. Now, here's the thing. I'm aware there are other good courses out there. And by all means, consume as many good sources of information on this as you can. I have some books I'd love to recommend you. Read widely, watch widely, observe widely. I am not the be-it, end-all knowledge woman. I'm not.
You're just very good at researching.
I'm also pissed off. So one of the reasons why we as a church are offering this class is because I was told what a different church was offering for sex education. And then I was told what a different church was offering for sex education. And a lot of it was abstinence-based, which doesn't work. And a lot of it was shaming and saying, you know, your body exists for someone else's pleasure, for someone else to make use of your... One of the sex education classes we found out was referring to people with uteruses and vaginas as hosts. They were hosts. They were baby incubators and nothing else. We had one person tell us that in church they were told that the orgasm of a vagina was a myth and that it was a temptation by demons. So, yeah, we decided to offer this because a church can. A church can. And in many cases, parents don't want to have a conversation with their kids. Schools don't want to have a conversation with their kids. So fine, we will. Now, all that being said, if you have factual corrections for me, if my research is off, cool, you bring those to my attention. If you just disagree with the science, go away. I'm not going to let you derail the information I am presenting to other people because you don't like it. One of the things we say in classes here is that your 6th grade understanding of biology does not determine reality. So, this is going to go beyond a 6th grade understanding of biology. All right. All species have genetic diversity. Let's talk about genetic diversity and what is sex and what is gender. That's where we're starting, okay? All species have genetic diversity. Their biological spectrum, no exceptions, not that we've found. Biological spectrums are universal, and from what we can tell, have basically always existed. So, is this good? Is this bad? Spectrums subvert the human goal of being able to classify nature. Humans like things to fall into very neat categories. It's one of the reasons why there's all these tests. What kind of personality do you have? Regardless of the fact that humans have an amazing spectrum of personalities, there is this pressure to be able to sort yourself into, this type and this type and this type and this type, right? There's only 4 humans, And I see this over and over and over again. We really like classification, and we're really, really bad at it. So if you don't believe me, look into the story of the philosophers and the chicken. Um, and that's how bad we are at classifying things. So the debate in evolutionary biology is whether variation within a species is good in its own right, or whether it's simply a collection of impurities that every species is basically stuck with. So we know that this amazing spectrum of biology exists. There's a debate on whether or not this is good and healthy, or whether it's just something we have to put up with because it just is. The debate isn't whether it exists, it's whether it's good or bad. Many evolutionary biologists are positive about the spectrum. I am not an evolutionary biologist. I am a cultural anthropologist, I'm a historian, I teach herbalism classes. I am by no means a biologist. Well, okay, I was a chemical operations engineer for a while.
But that's biochemistry?
It was biochemistry. It was specifically all of the chemical things that will totally destroy people. And what are they? And how do we negate their effects and do triage and things? So, certainly not. I was a chemist, not a biologist. Yeah. Many evolutionary biologists are positive about the spectrum. They view it as a reservoir of genes that can come to the forefront at different times and places to guarantee a species' survival under changing conditions. So basically, they're like, okay, cool, we have this spectrum of traits, and when it becomes necessary, those traits will become dominant. Or maybe more prevalent, if not dominant, and that will ensure the species' survival. There's actually a theory about homosexuality and it being a trait that helps humans survive. So, okay, cool.
Look at emperor penguins.
The variation is seen as a compilation of the species' genetic assets. So basically, this spectrum of biology is seen as like, cool, we have a bank. We have a reservoir. We have this compilation of genetic traits that we can pull from in the advent of rapidly changing conditions. And man, we are facing some rapidly changing conditions. This view is optimistic about the capability of species to respond to ever-changing environmental stressors. And it affirms positively the diversity that is found in the world. It says basically diversity is good. Diversity is positive. We are happy there is diversity. If there wasn't diversity, we all die. Other evolutionary biologists are negative about the spectrum of genetic presentation, believing that all gene pools, including our own, us as humans, are loaded with dangerous, deleterious mutations, bad genes, harmful permutations of genetic material. During the 1950s, there were some studies that claimed that every person had 3 to 5 lethal recessive genes that would surface if they chose the wrong person to have children with, and that this would cause their children to die. And people paid for a lot of money for genetic screening to make sure that they were marrying someone and having children with someone who didn't have these recessive traits. This was also a common theory in eugenics, that there is good genes and bad genes, and then we had to make sure only people with good genes were allowed to breed. Now, some of you know that Ian is Jewish and I'm Romani. We're not a big fan of eugenics. Beyond not being big fans of it, you know, what with the Czech Republic forcibly sterilizing 90,000 Romani women and, you know, all the Nazis and the dying, it's just been debunked. Eugenics has been rather thoroughly debunked. And the idea that we should only allow people from ideal gene pools to breed is how you get inbreeding and actually a lot of genetic problems. And yet there are still schools of geneticists and schools of evolutionists who believe that our evolution has reached its pinnacle and that all variation at this point is useless and harmful. And they say basically we should only be allowing the genetic elite to breed. And they're proponents of advanced artificial insemination as the primary form of breeding. So that's where that idea ends. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. Beyond eugenics is evil and it doesn't work. People who are intersex, people who are queer, people who are black and brown have always existed. We're not new. I mean, I'm a white, I'm pretty pale. I'm not referring to that. But black people and brown people are not new, and queer people are not new. And I am definitely queer. We've always existed. So the idea that we're somehow part of an unideal gene pool doesn't really make sense. And this view represses genetic diversity, and it says that the genetic diversity that has gotten us so far as human beings is bad. So that's fun. I belong to the genetic diversity is a good thing school of thought, and there's a lot of research supporting it. Anyway, moving right along. What is male and female? I'm a gender fluid person. Ian's a gender fluid person. We work with a lot of trans people. So if we're talking male and female, not as a gender identity, but as a sex, what does that even mean? Because we hear this a lot in LGBTQIA inclusive spaces, that sex and gender are different. So let's talk about assigned sex. Let's talk about a geneticist sitting in a lab somewhere looking at genetics and going, all right, I am assigning this the sex of female, I am assigning this the sex of male. Let's talk about something, a naturalist observing an animal species and saying, all right, well, these ones are the female ones and these ones are the male ones. Let's talk about someone going out and observing, a breeding species in the ocean and saying, all right, this one is male, and this one is female. How do they do that? If gender is a construct, how are they assigning that sex? Well, the only thing in your body that has a biological sex in any sense is your gametes. To some biologists, and I'm going to go into what the other biologists say in a minute, to some biologists, male means making small gametes, sperm, and female means making large gametes, eggs. Period. By definition, the smaller of the two gametes is sperm, and so that gets assigned the sex of male, and the larger is eggs, and the egg-producing species, the egg-producing individual, is said to be female. That's the sex, assigned sex. Beyond gamete size, biologists do not recognize any other universal difference between male and female. They don't. Of course, indirect markers of gamete size may exist in some species. In mammals, for example, males that are assigned male at birth, we assigned the sex, they're male, they produce sperm. We assigned the gender, they're male, we have determined, penis, presence of high testosterone balance is a male, usually have a Y chromosome. But whether an individual is classified by a geneticist or biologist as a male does not come down to whether or not they have a Y chromosome. It doesn't. It comes down to whether or not they produce sperm. Moreover, in birds, reptiles, and amphibians, the Y chromosome doesn't occur. However, the gamete size definition is general and works throughout the plant and animal kingdom. You can be assigned male at birth, live your entire life identifying as male, as your gender. You can produce sperm and die and go into a genetic study, DNA lab somewhere, and they'll go, this person didn't have a Y chromosome. It happens. It does. So, moving right along. Do species exist where this is not the case? Almost none. Almost none. Some species of algae, fungi, and protozoans have gametes that are all the same size. Mating then typically occurs between individuals in genetic categories called mating types rather than sexes. Often there are more than two mating types. In these cases, sex takes place between the mating types, but the distinctions of male and female sex don't apply because there is only one gamete size. By contrast, when gametes do come in more than one size, there are generally only two sizes, one very small and one very large. Multicellular organisms with 3 or more distinct gamete sizes are exceedingly rare, exceedingly rare. No organism on Earth is known to have a spectrum of gamete sizes where they have like these ones and 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 these ones. We haven't found one. More than 2 gamete sizes occur in some colonies of single-celled organisms, the protozoans. In green ciliate Chlamydomonas euchlora, the cells producing gametes may divide between 4 and 64 times, so somewhere in there, always in equal numbers. 4 divisions result in large gametes, and 64 divisions produce lots of small gametes. I mean, big and small being relative. These are protozoans. They're already really tiny. The cells that divide more than 4 times but less than 64 times make various intermediate-sized gametes, and this is the closest that we see to a spectrum of gamete sizes. Another ciliate, Pandurina, lives in colonies of 16 cells. During reproduction, some cells divide into 8 big gametes, and others divide into 16 small gametes. However, any 2 of these sizes of gametes can fuse. So 2 big ones can fuse, 1 big and 1 small one can fuse, or 2 small ones can fuse. These species are at the borderline between being single cells and multicellular organisms. So for practical purposes, male and female are universal biological categories that apply to sex, not gender, and which are defined by a binary distinction between small and large gametes, sperm and egg. So what does this perspective mean for the gender binary? The binary in gamete size does not extend outward to gender. It does not. There is no direct correlation. The biggest error of biology today is uncritically assuming that the gamete size binary implies a corresponding binary in chromosomal makeup, genitalia structure, and sexual and gender identity. It doesn't. It does not. No binary governs the whole of all individuals who make gametes or who bring them to one another for fertilization. So, there are also exceptions to that strict binary. One of the things that people are like, okay, so there is a sex binary. It's always one or the other. Nope. No, it's not. An individual who makes both large and small gametes at some point in life is called a hermaphrodite. An individual who makes both sizes at the same time is a simultaneous hermaphrodite, and the one who makes them at different times in their lifespan, is a sequential hermaphrodite. Most flowering plants are simultaneous hermaphrodites. They make pollen, so the small gamete, and seeds, the larger gamete, at the same time. A pollinated oval then turns into a tiny embryo that detaches to be blown away or carried off by an insect or an animal. Among animals, hermaphrodism is most common in the ocean. Most marine invertebrates such as barnacles, snails, starfish, fanworms, sea anemones are hermaphroditic. Many fish are too. Most species of wrasses, parrotfish, and large groupers are hermaphroditic, as are some damselfish, angelfish, gobies, porgies, emperors, soapfishes, dottybacks, and moray eels. Oh, and many deep-sea fish as well. Clownfish are amongst the most famous sequential hermaphrodites. At certain points in their life, a clownfish may produce small gametes. They may produce clownfish sperm. Later on in life, when a need shifts in the clownfish colony, there's not enough that produce large gametes, not enough that produce eggs, the clownfish will just change biological sex. They'll just change. And they'll go from being one that produces sperm to one that produces eggs. this ability to produce both kinds of gametes does also exist in humans. However, the term has changed. We try not to say hermaphrodites regarding human persons that present as being mixed in their gamete production. The preferred term for this is intersex. Now we're going to be talking about intersex quite a lot in these classes. In particular, intersex persons are far more common than they were once believed to be. DNA testing is revealing that is in fact exceedingly common. A conservative estimate, a low estimate for how common it is to be intersex, is 1 in 100. Now we're going to be talking about the spectrum of intersex, because not all intersex persons present with both sets of genitalia. Sometimes this is a purely internal thing, sometimes it's a purely genetic thing, and sometimes, yes, it's both sets of genitalia. In true gonadal intersex, so that's the term, an individual has both ovarian and testicular tissue separate, not sort of merged into one, but separate. Now, in that case, they may produce both sperm and eggs. They may produce small gametes and large gametes. Now, although this occurs, so far there has been no recorded case where both the small gamete and the large gamete operate perfectly. Now, there have been cases recorded where one set of gametes operates just fine. So an intersex person has gotten pregnant, has carried the child to term, has given birth with no problems. Or an intersex person has gotten another person pregnant and that person has given birth with no problems. But so far we have not observed someone who can do both. However, there has been a long pattern of involuntary sexual assignment surgeries, gender assignment surgeries, where people who are intersex may never know that they are intersex, or may not be given a chance to make use of both sets of their genitalia because one set is taken away from them. These numbers are skewed. The fact that we haven't observed it yet has been tweaked by human interference. And there's definitely cases in mythology, in human religion, of it being documented that someone was able to do both. Now, of course, someone will always march along and be like, well, the myths also say these things. Granted. Let's stop doing involuntary gender assignment surgeries on infants and see what happens. Anyway, moving right along. And the term for someone having both is ovotesticular disorder of sex development. I prefer just intersex, but okay. The only thing in your body that has a biological sex, the only thing in your body that has a biological sense in any sense, is your gametes, if you produce them. Because some people don't. Beyond some people producing both, there are some people who don't produce either. So it's their biological sex, which your body can easily stop producing as well. You can eventually just stop producing gametes. So do you still have a biological sex at that point? And which are a very minuscule part of your body. The rest of your body, including your genitals, have no biological sex. All right. There are way more than 2 or even 3 biological sexes if you use a different biological model. So that's, I said that there's one school of thought, one school of geneticists that say biological sex is whether you produce sperm or eggs. And we're just gonna say, okay, well, you produce sperm, you produce eggs. You produce sperm, you produce eggs. And that's how we're gonna sort everybody, regardless of the fact that there are some people who don't produce either and some people who produce both. That's just how we're gonna sort. Okay. To some biologists, sex should not be sorted by this, whether you produce sperm or eggs, but rather by the spectrum of chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, etc. By those biologists, primary sex or assigned sex at birth is defined by taking one or more item from each list I'm about to rattle off to you, roughly, because there are double dominant intersex conditions, there are double recessive intersex conditions. So this is honestly, this is a very incomplete model that I'm going to read off to you, and it gets far, far more complex than this. All potential combinations of what I'm going to read off to you could be said to constitute their own primary sex category, so their own assigned sex at birth. So you could take each of these many, many different things and say, all right, well, this one and this one and this one and this one together are this assigned sex at birth, and this one and this one and this one and this one together are this assigned sex at birth. And you wind up with just an infinite array of combinations, and that's just from what we know. So let's get into that. Chromosomes. In humans, we have observed XX, XY, X/X0, mosaic, XXY, XXXY, XXX, XYY, and way more. That's, like I said, that's a conservative list. Hormones. There's estrogenized, so someone who is estrogen and progesterone dominant. There's androgenized, so testosterone and androsterone dominant. There's double dominant, so high levels of both estrogenic and androgenic hormones. And there's double receptive, which is low or no sex hormones. And then there's other combinations as well. Before puberty, human children don't actually have all that many sexual hormones circulating in their bodies. And human children are often still quite clear about their own gender. Now, there's some debate about how much of that is social, but there are definitely trans children going, I'm trans, I'm not what you assigned me at birth. And they know really quite young, before you start having these hormone balances being in high levels. A woman, a cis woman, who goes through menopause or has a hysterectomy no longer has the same hormone balance. But we don't just suddenly disallow them to identify as a woman. Humans who have had their testicles removed, or who have lost their penises in an accident, or who have had their androgens depleted, usually because of testicular or prostate cancer, are usually still allowed to refer to themselves as a man. They say, like, hey, I know that I got my penis blown off in this accident, but I still feel like a man. Everyone's like, oh yeah, of course, buddy. Yeah, you are. Even though that changes that hormone balance. Let's see, where was I? Ovaries produce natural levels of testosterone. They do. Everyone's always like, oh, ovaries produce estrogen. They can also produce testosterone, and they do in quite high levels. And that doesn't change whether someone identifies or presents as a woman. No one's going to come up to someone who has ovaries and be like, your ovaries are producing testosterone. You're not a woman anymore. Because we don't actually define this by hormone balance. Pregnant humans often have particularly high level of testosterone, really high level of testosterone. Weirdly, the person who got them pregnant, if they stick around, if they're around while the person is pregnant, their testosterone levels will plummet. So a person who is hanging around the person they got pregnant, even though they have, a penis and they got this person pregnant, their testosterone levels will be very low, generally what we would associate with someone who was assigned female at birth. And the person who is pregnant has very high testosterone levels. Yeah, during the whole pregnancy, it's quite common. And yet, we don't say that a cisgender father of a fetus stops being a male because he has less testosterone. And we don't say that the cisgender mother of a fetus stops being a female because her estrogen is low. Pregnancy gets weirder too. Decades after the fetus has been removed or moved on, a pregnant person who once harbored an XY fetus will have XY cells in their brain and in the rest of their body. If you looked at the brain of a mother of an assigned male at birth child who was XY, you might find male tissues in her brain, where her body traded for some fresh young stem cells from her fetus and used them to replenish her own older tissues. So a cisgender person born XX can exhibit microchimerism later in life and never even know it. But having XY tissue in your brain doesn't make you a man. Gonads. Testicles, ovaries, ovotestes, gonads, testicular. I never know if this is pronounced agenesis, gonadal digenesis, and it goes on and on and on. Intersex persons have all manner of external and internal genitalia formations. I'm not going to try and list them all here. They have all manner of internal and external gonads. So genitals, you see people who have penises, vaginas, pseudovaginal pouches, clitoromegaly, micropenises, hypospadias, diphalia, and more. So the gonads and the genitals vary, and these are two different characteristics. There are at least a dozen primary sexes, what we would call assigned sex at birth. And that's before secondary sexual characteristics come into the equation. So presence of an Adam's apple, presence of breasts, presence of a large amount of body hair, a little bit of body hair, all of that, including how broad your shoulders are, how broad your hips are, that comes into it all later as secondary sexual characteristics. And again, doesn't actually define assigned sex at birth or assigned gender at birth. Doesn't. In real life, very few people actually match up with all 5 categories. Estimates by the Intersex Society of North America have noted that the prevalence of intersex conditions is going up. We're finding more and more and more of them. And I don't think this is because there's hormones in our drinking water or because of chemtrails or anything of that nature. I think it's because we're being willing to acknowledge it. I think it's because the advances of genetic testing, genetic screening, we're able to detect it. You know, the fact that we can look at people's organs while they're still alive. That's amazing. There are people out there with XY chromosomes, testes, a vulva, a vagina, female secondary sex characteristics, and male hormone patterns. There are people with XX chromosomes, testes, a penis, male secondary characteristics, and female hormone patterns. And there are people who have both male and female secondary sex characteristics or hormone patterns at the same time. And this is all regardless of their genetic makeup, their chromosomal makeup, their gonads, or their genitalia. In order for a binary to be considered a binary, every single person on Earth must completely match up to all 5 markers of sex at the same time. And that's just not what happened. Not at all. Not in real life. There are hundreds of millions of people that do not fall into that sex binary. They just don't. They do not sort neatly into it. Let's break down some myths. An organism is solely male or solely female for life. Nope. The most common body form among plants and in perhaps half the animal kingdom is for an individual to be both male and female at the same or at different times during their life. These individuals make both small and large gametes during their life. And this is setting aside, so that's if we're using the small gamete, large gamete model for primary sex, for assigned sex. Okay, but if we're not using that model, if we're using those 5 markers, then yeah, definitely not. Males are bigger than females on the average. Nope, in a lot of species, especially fish, the female is bigger than the male. Females, not males, give birth, is one of those myths. Nope, in many species, the female deposits the eggs in the pouch of the male who incubates them until birth. In many species, males, not females, tend the nests and give birth.
Seahorses are a common example.
Seahorses. Males have XY chromosomes and females have XX chromosomes. Nope. Again, in birds, including domesticated poultry like chickens, the reverse is true. In many other species, males and females show no difference in chromosomes. None at all. It's just gamete size. In all alligators and crocodiles, some turtles and lizards, and the occasional fish, sex is determined by the temperature at which the eggs are raised. A female can control the sex ratio among her offspring by laying eggs in a shady or in a sunny spot.
They're doing interesting work on beaches with turtle eggs to help repopulate the egg-bearing population because the sand is heating up to the point.
Oh, climate change is killing off all of the
It's making
laying turtles?
No, it's because climate change is making it so that you only have small gamete turtles being born.
Mm-hmm.
So there are people who are going in great waves working on figuring out ways to cool down the sand on beaches where they lay their eggs so that the species of sea turtles can continue.
Cool.
Yeah,
All right.
It's kind of awesome that people are building, grouping together to try to save turtles in that way.
The male has the penis and the female lactates. Nope. In the spotted hyena, females have a penis-like structure externally identical to that of males, and in the fruit bat of Malaysia and Borneo, the males have the milk-producing mammary glands. Males control females. Nope. In some species, female controls males, and in many, many mating systems, it's a dynamic interaction between female and male choice. Females may or may not prefer a dominant male. I don't prefer a dominant male. Females prefer monogamy and males want to play around. Nope. Depending on the species, either or both sexes may play around. We're going to be getting into the bonobos. Lifelong monogamy is actually really rare in most species, and even within monogamous species, females may initiate divorce in order to acquire a higher ranking male. So, moving right along, this is still, even with all we're talking about, been a relatively human-centric thing. I want to talk about the fact that there are vertebrate animals that don't use chromosomes as their sex determination system. And that there are vertebrate animals that use different chromosomal arrangements. There are birds that are not XXXY, they're ZWZZ. In birds, the egg determines the sex, not the sperm, and females are heterogamous sex with ZW chromosomes.
Yeah, this one says.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Platypus have a system that resembles XX and XY and ZW and ZZ, but it gets very, very complicated. Platypus males are XY, 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 and females are XXXXXXX. Clearly, whatever, if you believe in a divine mind that designed the world, then clearly it didn't decide that all males would have XY chromosomes and a penis and a high androgenic balance. And before I move into the next thing, which is has to do with bonobos and other chimpanzees, and it is rather important, I do want to touch on, are we related to chimpanzees? And the reason that I want to do this is because I got into a debate. We were talking about the fact that we were going to be doing these sex education classes, and it came up at an Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada meeting with some of the other religious leaders in town. And basically they were talking about the sex ed classes that their churches offer. And I mentioned that we were going to be doing one as well. And one of the people there was like, oh, I do hope that you won't be saying that we're related to monkeys. And I was like, excuse me? Because this person is not from a fundamentalist extremist Christian church. She's actually from a church that talks about how open-minded and universal its concepts are and how it believes in all of these different spiritual perspectives. It's actually a spiritualism church. And I was kind of like, excuse me, what? And she says, oh, please don't tell me you're going to be teaching people that they come from monkeys, because it doesn't make any sense to me. And I was like, why does evolution not make any sense to you? And I'm not even going to address the whole we come from monkeys thing and how that's
inaccurate.
That's inaccurate.
We share a common ancestor.
Right, we share a common ancestor, but I'm not getting into it. Just why are you opposed to evolution being part of our sex ed classes? And she says, well, because if we came from monkeys or apes or chimpanzees, well, they wouldn't exist anymore, would they? And she says,
that's not how evolution works.
I know it's not. She said, if we're the product of evolving from them, they wouldn't exist anymore. So, yep, I'm gonna touch on it. And it is actually relevant to this, I promise. The evidence for being closely related to chimpanzees is vast and well understood, thanks to advances in DNA analysis. We share a huge amount of our DNA with chimpanzees, and not just repeating patterns in non-coding DNA. We have numerous genes that are identical and likely diverged around 7 million years ago. We probably diverged around the same time as Sahelanthropus tiscadensis. So C. tacadensis was was a woodland species with basal ape and basal human-like traits. The most notable was the position of the foramen magnum towards the central base of the skull, and the knot emerging from the back suggests bipedality. This, along with other traits such as small canines worn at the tip, implies a reduced or absent C/forward/P3 honing complex, the diastema. So, which suggests that the basal traits and more pronounced diastema that we see in other species was a trait that came later. But more on that later. Our chromosomes and chimpanzee chromosomes are structured far more like each other than other mammals. Furthermore, the genes located on those chromosomes are very similar. Chromosome 2, for instance, is nearly identical to 2 chimpanzee chromosomes. Chromosome 2 in humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans is different from chromosome 2 found in apes and is actually the remnant of an ancient mutation where chromosome 2 and 3 merged. You can see this from vestigial centromeres and genes found in it. So we can't get DNA from fossil material, but Neanderthal and Denisovan subfossils have demonstrated that this reduced chromosome count, we have one fewer pair than apes, is a typical trait of the Homo genus. So I'm not gonna keep going into this. I have a great deal, I actually have like 5 pages of notes on how closely we are related to chimpanzees. Our closest living relatives are the chimpanzees. And there is some debate on whether bonobos are considered chimpanzees or not. They both orangutans and bonobos belong to the same umbrella. And that umbrella should really just be homo, but it's not, because we like human exceptionalism and we refuse to recognize that we're chimps, but we are. We're very smart chimps, but chimps we are nonetheless. Now, one of the reasons I bring this up in our sex education classes, before we move on to penis versus vagina versus intersex and all the facts that people need to know about how those things work, which will be next week because I'm running out of time already. I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about why it's so important at chimps when we're studying sexuality, and in particular human sexuality, and when we're teaching something like a sex ed class. Because wow, there are a lot of scientists that only want to look at orangutans. And there's a reason for that, and I want to talk about it. So, orangutans demonstrate a great deal of sexual violence. They demonstrate a great deal of forced sexual contact. In fact, dominant males violently force sexual contact onto females, and in some cases downright kidnap them. They literally violently haul them away from their families, deprive them of food, and force sex upon them. And a great many orangutan babies are created through forced sexual contact. And I've had a lot of people say that this is just the structure of human sexuality, that this is how we're supposed to be. And they talk about testosterone balance, which we're going to be bringing up next class, and about how testosterone doesn't do what you think it does. It does not. It does not do what you think it does. And we've known this for a while, actually. But they say this is normal. And they don't want to look at the bonobos, because bonobos demonstrate an entirely different sexual structure through their species. They actually demonstrate, let's see, polysexualism, multiple sexual partners. They demonstrate the females having multiple male sexual partners, as well as homosexuality, which is actually really quite common, homosexuality in bonobos. They have orgies. They masturbate. They have anal sex. They perform their version of cunnilingus. They perform their version of fellatio. They demonstrate a use of multiple sex positions. They have sex for fun. They have a version of sex work. There are bonobos who have sex in exchange for food and in exchange for shelter.
The penguins.
Yep, penguins do this too. We have observed sex worker penguins. We have observed stripper penguins, for, I guess, exotic dancer penguins, for lack of a better term, and pebble penguins. So pebble penguins exchange pebbles as a form of mating thing, and we've observed that some will take pebbles in exchange for sex, but they won't actually form any kind of a partnership, sexual or romantic, with other penguins. We've also observed that penguins will pay other penguins to perform the sexy mating dance, but not actually sex acts. So there are exotic dancer penguins, and there are sex worker bonobos. In bonobos, we've seen very, very little sexual violence. And primarily everybody seems to be having a blast. They're having a blast. There's homosexuality, there's orgies, there's fellatio, there's sex workers, and they seem to be having a great time. So one, why are people only looking at orangutans when they want to talk about our closest living relative and our own sexual behavior? Well, I can tell you why. But also, why? Why is one chimpanzee so sexually violent, and why is another chimpanzee so sexually non-violent? And the current theories have to do with, one, the prevalence of food, how easy it is to get access to food, and how this turns into competitiveness, but also culture. And people are like, well, chimpanzees don't have cultures. Yes, they do. They do have cultures. We know this. We've studied chimpanzee cultures. Look up the ladder experiment. We know that other primates have cultures. There are animal cultures. I mean, people like to misquote wolf culture all the time. Misportray wolf culture
wolves.
Everywhere. Like, oh my gosh, if you quote the wolf culture to me from Bad Werewolf Fic, like, you know the one. You know it. It's bullshit.
Are we talking about ABO fetishes?
Yes. It's bullshit. That's not how wolves operate. But they have an actual culture and they have a mythological culture. Cool. So do chimpanzees. And in particular, something happened where a chimpanzee group had sexually violent males that raped and beat and kidnapped females, deprived them of food to force them into sexual behavior. And they liked to take more than their fair share of food. And in particular, they liked to raid the food that came from this local resort and that this local resort threw away. And at one point, they ate more than their fair share of a bunch of food from that resort and all died. They all died. And I don't feel bad for the rapist chimpanzees that died because they stole more than their fair share of food. I really don't. But what happened was that the female chimpanzees raised the male chimpanzee children instead of allowing the adult males to raise the male chimpanzee children. And the culture of sexual violence ended. It ended. And they raised each successive generation to be more like the bonobos. And we started seeing homosexuality and fellatio and cunnilingus and orgies and multiple sex partners and a happier, healthier sex culture in this chimpanzee group. So absolutely, chimpanzees have a culture, and it can be either sexually violent or sexually free. Just like humans have a sex culture, and it can be sexually violent or sexually free. And there's absolutely a reason why, when teaching about our closest living relatives and about sex, these cis, male, straight, people are going, oh, well, men are just naturally more sexually violent. We're just meant to be that way. I mean, look at gorillas. Look at chimps. They rape their partners. It's just natural. No, it isn't.
It really isn't.
It's constructed. All right. Next week, we're going to pick up on things that nobody's taught you about penises, things that nobody's taught you about vaginas, things that everyone really does need to know about hymens by now. And how testosterone and estrogen actually work, and also how the fertilization of an egg actually works. Because you know that story that they like to show us with the one creepy video of all the sperm attacking the egg? That doesn't actually happen. It's a myth. It's a lie that your teachers tell you. So we're going to start that next week, and these will just be hour-long classes once a week until we get through all of our material. Please feel free to send me your questions and respectful comments, and I will happily answer them respectfully. Thank you all for attending. I hope you have a wonderful night. Be safe out there.